sign that says, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But you know what? The king can. And so this is not a story that I want to tell you today of how I fixed my life or how anybody else did, but the story of how our great king put this life that was so broken back together, a life that I didn't think could ever be fixed. Because so many people will tell you that those that are living in LGBT lifestyles, transgender, homosexual, whatever it may be, that that's who they are and they're never going to change. But I want to tell you the story of transformation. And it started very early in life, and it's taken me a long time to wrestle with some of the early causes. When I went into the lifestyle, I would have told you what everyone else says, that I was born that way, I'd always felt that way, and that's just who I was. There wasn't anything that made me feel that way. It wasn't until after I came out that I began to see some of the things some of the lies that I had believed early in childhood. And one of those lies that I began to believe very early in my life is that my mom didn't love me. And I recognize now, like I said, it's taken me a long time to kind of wrestle through that. And I've learned that the enemy lies to us. And I've heard so many times from different people these perceptions that we have, these things that we hear, these things that we interpret as little children. And part of that, I think, is just the brokenness of this world. You know, I can guarantee you, none of us are ever going to be the perfect parent. We are going to hurt our children at times. We're going to hurt everyone else. None of us are going to be perfect. And as a little child, I think one of the main reasons I was much closer to my dad, and we were always doing things together, and I didn't realize at the time, because I'm a child and I don't have any real responsibilities, I didn't realize everything Mom was doing for the family. You know, I didn't really, she's doing all the cooking and the cleaning, and plus she was working, plus doing a lot at the church. And she was trying very hard in her own strength, I think, to really please and serve the Lord with all her heart. But I think often left her exhausted, too exhausted for a very rambunctious, energetic little child. And so I don't blame her one bit. But that was difficult as a child because I often felt like Mom just wanted me to go away. Just leave her alone, go to your room or things like that. And I can tell you, this isn't just, again, this is often just perceptions, but we begin to believe these things, and these seeds that start as a lie begin to bear fruit in our lives. Just like good fruit, or good seed will bear good fruit, well, bad seed can bear bad fruit. And so, just to give you another example, there's a very good friend of mine who spent many years, probably most of his life, thinking that his dad didn't love him. And it wasn't until he was in his 30s that he learned the truth. See, when he was about 8 or 9 years old, he didn't know at the time that he had a medical condition that made him much weaker than most males, and he grew up on a farm with several brothers, and he couldn't do the work that they could. And he was always breaking the tools that he was supposed to be using because he wasn't strong enough. And so one time he heard his dad say, "Stupid!" And he thought his dad was talking about him. And his whole life he believed his dad thought he was stupid and he wasn't as good as his brothers. Turns out his dad wasn't even talking about him. He was talking about something completely different. But for probably 30 years, he believed that his dad thought he was stupid. And so sometimes in our life, Satan will take those things, and we can either choose to forgive and to talk about those things, and we can go to the people that have hurt us, or the people that we've hurt, and we can talk about these things and bring it into the light and forgive, or we can choose to hold on to them. The Lord gave me kind of a mental picture one time of what had started to happen as I was holding on to this sort of bitter root in my life. And the more I held on, the more it began to wrap sort of this thorny vine around my life. So as a child, I became more and more bitter. And, I like everything began to get through this, put through this filter of Mom doesn't love me. And I remember comparing myself to my brother. She was much closer to my brother. And I think this happens a lot in nature because of different personalities and things. That it dawned on me just a few months ago. I was like, oh, Jacob and Esau. One child was very close to one parent, one very close to the other. But I was so jealous of my brother. and I was jealous of the way that they got along much better. And I was spending a lot of time with my dad and my brother anyway, but I began to really act a lot more like my brother. And I thought, maybe if I am more like my brother, maybe mom will want to spend more time with me. So as I began to act more like him, I began to be labeled tomboy. And I hated that label because deep down inside, I wanted to fit in with the other girls, but I didn't quite know how, because now I'm acting very boyish, and the girls began to reject me, and the girls began to say, oh, you're not really one of us, and I was always ended up going and playing with the boys. And I just always kind of felt like I was on the outside of them. Even early things, there was constant comparison, and I think that's something that as children, when we're trying to find our identity, we're always comparing ourselves to everyone else. And I remember that we grew up in kind of a small school, and there were only about 4 other girls in our class, and I remember one day they were all doing like gymnastics and dance kind of stuff, and that was stuff I had never done and couldn't do, really didn't have any clue how. And I remember, but as a little girl, I began to interpret that as all the girls but me are doing this. So that means I'm not one of the girls. And it just began to, at a very early age, to sort of shatter my identity as a girl. And so I began to fantasize more and more about being a boy. And I began to think that my life would have been better as a boy. And I began to write stories. I was writing all the time. Mom used to find me up at 2 or 3 in the morning writing with flashlights. And I'd write these stories about how I was a boy. And then I began to play lots of video games. And in video games, I could become this other character. And so I would live in this virtual world with this male character. And this character was heroic, and everybody loved him, these kind of things. But it began to dissociate me more and more from who I truly was. But back then, I hadn't heard of transgenderism. I didn't know there was anything you could do about it, and there still isn't. But now they've come up with a way that they say that you can. But as I began to sort of drift through life, always this nagging sensation, or this nagging feeling that I was supposed to be a boy, and I was just getting angry. But it really began when I was 13. I had sort of it was an encounter with God, but I wasn't saved at that time. I didn't know Lord. I had been baptized as a small child, but I never really understood what it meant to have a relationship with Jesus. I didn't know what it meant to give my life to Him. I didn't really know true repentance. I didn't know what true surrender was like. But I had gone to summer camp year after year, and this particular year they were talking about foreign missions, and I knew that I was called to be a missionary. So I went forward at Falls Creek and I dedicated my life to be a missionary. And, I don't think Satan liked that very much. The next year my life sort of began to fall apart. I finally had a few girls that I could relate to and had as friends. They were on my soccer team, and we were over at one of their houses one night, and she pulled something out of her closet I'd never heard of before called a Ouija board. And a lot of people say this is very innocent and it's just a game. Well, I can tell you it's not. It was real, and some very dark spirits began to come into my life. And I began to have more and more anger issues. I would go into these horrible rages sometimes. My mom said sometimes I would yell and scream at her at the top of my lungs, and I'd wake up the next morning not remembering any of it. And as I was getting more and more angry anyway, the gender issues were really coming to a head. I was having trouble with my body. I was diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome, which meant that there were cysts all over my ovaries. And so this body that I don't want in the first place is causing me nothing but pain. And then they were telling me I was likely never going to get pregnant. And I thought, you're telling me that God made me a girl. That, again, and even though I realize now how much my mom did love me, at the time I'm thinking my mom doesn't even want me, or maybe wish that I had been a boy. And now it's not even working properly, and I was just so angry. And I thought, if this is who God is, and I tried to actually, I was going at the time through a world religion class, and I tried very hard to convince myself I was an atheist, and a lot of kids do. But I can tell you this, that this was true in my own life, but it's also true in many that I've talked to. They have done surveys, and it was like 86% or so of atheists will admit that they're really angry with God. But it's like, who are they so angry at? They don't believe. But the reason that most kids turn away from their faith is not because they don't believe it. It's because they're angry. And so I was walking down the hall one day, and I knew so deep down that it was true. But I said, God, I will never serve you again. And so I walked away. Oh, they went off again. But anyway, so I walked away determined to never serve God again, determined to go my own way. I remember thinking, I am going to do everything I've ever been told not to do. I'm going to sin as much as possible. And I wanted to be the most evil person out there. It is a miracle I didn't end up in a satanic cult. Now, I think the only reason I didn't really was because of a lack of Google. I couldn't just look up in Google where the nearest one was. But my life was filled with lots of partying, drinking. It's also another miracle. I look back and God had his hand on me. There was a lot he allowed, but there was a lot he kept me from. I was around a lot of people doing some very serious drugs. And for some reason I never got into it. And I'm very, very thankful looking back. But my days were getting darker and darker and darker. And by the time I went to live with my uncle when I was 17, and my uncle said that he had seen a demon in the house. And I know that I had brought some very dark presences into the house. And he prayed with me one time. He wanted to, because we had seen this thing manifesting. Like, there was one point where I had drawn this detailed drawing of a demon in my notebook. And he said I got out of the shower one day, and he went in after me and said this demon was drawn in the steam of the mirror. And I don't remember doing it. And so he said one time he wanted to pray and cast this thing out. And I was sitting there at the time. I didn't want it to leave. I wanted to be evil because I was still really angry with God. And I was sitting there asking this thing not to leave me. And he prayed for about 10 or 15 minutes, and he finally looked up at me and he said, God told me you don't want to let it go. And I was stunned. I was like, whoa, I didn't know how to talk to people. You know, I had thought years earlier, I forgot to mention, I thought I had heard the Lord speak to me one time, but after that I decided that, you know, I had bought into this idea that God sort of made all of creation, but then didn't care about us and didn't speak to us. So I chalked that up to I had just heard things. But this time I knew God had spoken to my uncle, because that's exactly what I was sitting there thinking. And he, with tears in his eyes, he said, do you want to let it go? And I said, no. And he said, okay. And I remember the sadness in his eyes. He wanted so desperately to be able to help me. But I wasn't ready. I was so angry. And on top of all the demonic things, by this time in high school, I had been in so many different relationships and had gone down a very, very dark path. And I was just being treated worse and worse and worse by the boys. No matter what I gave away, the worse I was being treated. And I just thought, you know, I'm just never going to be loved by these men. And in college, I had gained a bunch of weight, and I was just feeling more and more in love. So now I got to a point where I had almost become like a prostitute without even getting paid for it, because I was so desperate. But it got to a point where I couldn't even give it away. Men just didn't want me. And I finally ended up in this horrible relationship with a man that was a severe alcoholic. I couldn't hardly stand being around him, but I didn't want to be alone. And I ended up almost living with him. And I remember thinking I wanted to leave him after the first couple of months, but I was so lonely that I ended up staying with him for almost 4 years. And by the end of the relationship, I finally realized, I thought, you know, the reason that this is never working out, the reason that I'm never happy, is because I was supposed to be the man. And if I was the man, then I would show these men how a woman's really supposed to be treated. And so I began to embrace this idea that I was supposed to be a man. And I still hadn't heard of transgenderism. So I began to look up on Google, because now we have Google. And you know, Satan will always find a way to tell you what you want to hear. So I look up and I just entered the phrase, girl becoming a boy, just to see if anybody out there felt like I did. And I thought, wow, there's all these people out there that feel like I do. And I found a support group in Tulsa where I was living at the time. And I went, and the first day I was very, very nervous, and I thought, I don't know if these people are going to really be like me, if they're going to understand. And they had me share a little bit about who I was, and within 5 minutes they were, oh, you are definitely transgender. I thought, I knew it. I knew that was me. And then, I said, well, I'm worried that I'll never look like a man. And they said, oh, don't worry about it. After taking hormones for a year or so, no one's ever going to know you were a girl. And that's what I've been wanting to hear for so many years. You know, there are some that live very out and proud of being transgender. I was not. I didn't want anyone to know. I wanted to completely erase the existence of Laura, and I wanted to become someone else. See, because the truth of transgenderism is that it's all about escaping pain. It's about cutting off who you really are and coming up with another identity that doesn't feel that pain. They don't realize that consciously, but it's very much like taking drugs. This is just another form of drugs or alcohol. It's a way to cover the pain, and it's a way of escaping rather than how Jesus wants to heal us. Our human nature is to want to cover it like a Band-Aid. The problem is if you have a wound, with gangrene growing, all the bandages in the world are not going to fix it. You can take painkillers, it's not ever going to make it okay. And eventually it will kill you. And so, but I started this journey with all the hope in the world. I mean, I was just, the first year, I felt like a little kid again. And it was like, I remember I had a partner at the time that was also transgender. He was male to female. So he had been born male. And we had this, we were doing things that like little kids would do almost, because we were sort of reliving our childhood. And so he threw me this birthday party with a race car cake, like all these silly things. But it was just like I was on cloud nine, and it was like I was reinventing myself. And, but after the first year or so, I began to I was getting really tired of sort of the fakeness of everything. I was, I really liked it all, and I liked the attention I was getting, but I really still wasn't passing very well. I'd been on hormones for a few months, but now my voice was beginning to get lower, so I was just beginning to see some changes, and I thought, I know right now this is fake, but one day this is going to be real. And so I really believed that as I transitioned, that this was going to be real one day, and I was going to find that peace and happiness. So I had my name legally changed, and then as I was taking the hormones, my voice had begun to get lower, began to grow just a little bit of facial hair, and I had so many people around me telling me how wonderful I was, and I was working at my job now under a male name, and so this seemed like the answer to all my problems. But a couple of years later, I was frustrated because I was constantly reminded by the reality of my own body that I was still in this female body. But I thought the body was the problem. I wanted to fix the body to match what I felt inside. And so I began, in 2009, I went to San Francisco and had an outpatient double mastectomy. Because I was so convinced that this is who I was. People now that I've left the lifestyle often say, oh, you were never really transgender. First of all, nobody is, because it isn't real. But even at the time, I was so convinced this is who I was willing to do absolutely anything to get there. And, after my surgery, I thought this was everything I ever wanted. I was so excited by the results, and I even had a reconstructive procedure to look more like a male chest, and I just thought it was going to be everything I ever wanted, and I was on cloud nine. And I went back to work a few weeks later, and my boss at the time, she was a lesbian. She was very pro-LGBT. She thought this was all wonderful. She helped me plan the trip. But a few weeks later, she came back to me and she said, look, I don't know what's going on, but you're moping around here, you're depressed, you're not working as hard, you're unmotivated. I don't know what's wrong with you, but I want the old Jacob back. And I thought, what do you mean? I'm the happiest I've ever been in my life. I don't know what you're talking about. I was mad. And I thought, whatever, I'm still recovering, be all right in a few weeks. And I went home that night and I thought, I just couldn't get it out of my head. And I thought, what is she seeing in me that I'm not seeing in myself? And the truth was, I had been really depressed. Because I had realized that even though I liked the physical results, my surgery hadn't made me a man. And I felt so stupid. I thought, I should have realized that just removing part of the body was not going to make me a man. And the reality began to set in a little bit. But I still wanted it to be true. So I still began to pursue this, and I thought, it's just because, maybe in another year of hormones or so, because I didn't understand biology. I wasn't very good at science, and I really thought that taking all these hormones was going to transform me into a man. So I thought, I just needed another year or two of hormones, then I'll be a man. Well, that still wasn't helping, and so a couple years later, I had all of my female organs removed. And I thought that was going to fix the problem. And when that didn't fix the problem, I was devastated. And I thought, what if this never is real? Now, by this time, I've alienated my family. I've completely pushed them all away. And I have nothing. But this is sort of what I had staked my entire life on. I was drifting through life with various jobs. All I was living for was this transition. And I thought, once I have the identity, once it's all real, then I will go on with life and figure life out. But at that time, that's all I was living for. And when I began to realize it wasn't real, I was in the depths of despair. But I thought, there's no way I'm going to be a girl. So, I'm sort of stuck this way. This is the best it's ever going to get, but at least I don't have to be a girl. So I began to drift through life for the next couple of years. I had no desire to turn back to the Lord. I was so far from God by this time. But the Lord had been drawing me. I didn't know then that there was an army praying for me. And I can look back now and I begin to see little ways that God was drawing me and softening me over the years. For example, about a year into my journey, I was driving down the road. I was listening to some horrible music. And I just want to warn some of the young people in this room. I know that your friends probably listen to a lot of bad music. You guys may be into that. I can tell you that the music that I used to listen to took me down into such darkness. And it really began to destroy my life, and it kept me in such a dark, angry state. So I just want to plead with you to make sure that what you're putting in your mind and into your heart is the truth and is honoring to the Lord, not just as some legalistic rule, but because it will destroy your life. Satan wants you to listen to that dark music. But I was driving down the road, and all of a sudden, and I had not listened to Christian music in years, I hadn't prayed in many years, but all of a sudden I was like, I'm so sick of this music. I'm so tired of being so angry. And for no reason at all that I cannot explain on this earth, I turned off the music that I'd been listening to and turned on Christian radio for the first time in years. And there was like this, and I wasn't saved at that moment, but it was like all of a sudden that darkness began to lift off of me. And it was just this moment of clarity, I think. And I can look back and I see how the Lord was working on me. But it still didn't change me at that time. But I can see the Lord's hand in it. And then there were times that the Lord was giving me dreams and visions. I had a dream one night that Jesus came back and I was left behind. And that was really scary. And I thought, what if I read, because I had read all the books, right? I'd seen the movies of the Left Behind series. And I'm like, what if I am left behind? And I was scared. And so the Lord was drawing me, and also one of the weirdest ways he was drawing me, my partner at the time was very into politics. He was one of only 2 or 3 people I've ever met in the community that were conservative. And so here we were, 2 transgenders, getting into conservative politics, and I began to listen to conservative talk radio. And of all things, which that is almost unheard of in my community. But every once in a while, they were talking about God. And it really wasn't even Christian radio at the time. It was just, they would talk about God, but they were getting bolder and bolder. And just people like Glenn Beck, for example, which I know is Mormon. Mom was panicking a little bit when I told her I was getting into Glenn Beck. But honestly, the Lord used it to draw me just a little bit back to God. But I still didn't want to admit my sin. I didn't want to turn from the life because I still wanted it to be real. I was still so determined that some way there had to be something out there that would make this real. At one point, I even started looking up, I'd been watching some about horror movies, and I started looking up some witchcraft spells to see if I could become a man. I was getting that desperate, and I knew in my head that wasn't going to be possible, but I just couldn't admit that I had made a mistake. But God wasn't done with me yet. And my mom one day, I hadn't talked to my mom much in years, other than I would once in a while, I would sort of build up enough guilt that I would call her, like when I'd missed a birthday or a holiday, and then after a few months I would call again. They were coming to meet me once in a while in Tulsa to have dinner. I really didn't want anything to do with them. And if some of you have loved ones, prodigals that have cut you out of their life, that happens a lot. I know many that do, and that's honestly what I wanted, and it's only by the grace of God that they were in my life. It was really my partner. He had lost his mom when he was about 7, and he lost his dad when he was about 19, so he pushed me all the time to go do stuff with them. So, but it was more of an obligation. But one day, in fact, I meant to do this earlier, and I kind of forgot, but Mom, is there any way you would share for just a few minutes on, do you mind? I know it's all out of the blue, but what the Lord told you, and like after I came out. Do you mind sharing for just a few minutes? Like the night I came out, and how the Lord began to change you. She doesn't mind, right? You speak all the time. I wanted to hear your...
Okay, that night?
Yeah, and then over the next few years.
Okay, it was on our 40th wedding anniversary, and we had not seen Laura in a while, so we decided that we would ask her to join us for dinner in Tulsa. And when she walked into the restaurant, she had butched her hair off and just looked awful. And I didn't say anything at that time, but when Paul excused himself to go to the men's room, I just looked at her and I looked her right in the eye and I said, "Laura, are you trying to look like a man?" Tears began rolling down her cheeks. She said, "Yes, Mom, I am." Have you ever felt the proverbial elephant on your chest? That's exactly how I felt. I didn't know if I could even eat. I thought I was going to throw up all over the table. We didn't say anything then because we were in a public place, but when we went back to her apartment, I told her she was going to tell her dad. And she cried. She said, "I don't want to tell him." I said, "We're not leaving until you tell your dad." And so that night, when Paul and I got back home, I really just was face down. And I told the Lord, because Laura will tell you, I always had a plan. I'm a doer. So if there's a problem, here's what we need to do. Step 1, step 2, and always, like that. Well, I had to really tell the Lord, I don't have a plan. This is something I cannot fix. And so he began to teach me over the next few months that I needed to come in absolute surrender to him, work on my relationship with him, and make that a priority in my life, and I felt like he would work on Laura. And so he brought me to that, and he began to give me a peace even in the midst of a dark pit. He gave me a peace like I've never known. That peace that passes all understanding was mine. And it took several more years. But God really began to change me because of the dark valley that he had allowed us to go through.
And what about the cup?
Oh, okay. I know where she's headed. I get up very early in the morning, usually about 4:45, 4 o'clock. Don't feel sorry for me because I go to bed about 8. So I'm just fresh in the morning, and I'm a morning person. And that's when I have all my quiet time and study and so forth, and we lost me again. Anyway, one morning, God had began giving me some little glimmers of hope. You know, I began to see little things that Laura's kind of softening and turning around and so forth. And so my mind goes into action. You know, oh, I know what I can do to help God. Help this all along. You know, and so I had a little plan. And it was just clear as a bell in my heart. God said, okay, if you want to work on her, I'm not. But if you want me to work on her, God, he said, you go sit on the sofa. Basically, go sit on the sofa. You stay here. In the Word, memorize it, meditate on it, surrender yourself and surrender her to me, and I'll work on her. But if you're going to take over, he would be hands off. So you know what I did. Otherwise, she would not be here giving her testimony. So God took over, and he's the one that did the transformation actually in both of us. Okay?
Thank you. I appreciate you coming up and sharing. I know I couldn't put you on the spot, but I like hearing my mom's perspective. And I think a lot of times as parents, you need to hear that. And hear that, I think sometimes I hear from parents this burden to save their kids. Remember, this is not your burden. It is the Lord's burden to save everyone. He doesn't have any grandchildren. None of us can ride our parents' coattails. We all need an encounter with God. We all need to come to our own faith, and it is He that is the Savior. But as the Lord was working on me, so I wanted to take that detour for just a second to make this point really clear, because sometimes people confuse this part of my story and say, oh, her mother fixed her. No, she had given up on fixing. She had tried to fix me my whole life. But now, all of a sudden, and I remember looking back one day, and I was like, Mom's not trying to fix me anymore. But, so this was not her plan to fix me. But she had been out of her years of surrender. The Lord had led her to teach a Bible study. And so now she was teaching this Bible study, and it had grown so much. I don't even know, what was it at the time, maybe 40? It started with 12 in a home and then got to maybe 40 or so. And so they wanted to start putting the lessons online. It was growing so much. When people were missing, they were really upset. So she called and asked if I would make a website for her Bible study. I didn't have any interest in the Bible study, but okay, she was going to pay me. And I was spending so much on things I shouldn't. I really needed some money. And I said, all right, I'll make a website for you. And as I did, I remember, this is so funny the way that God works. I had a couple of major problems, and I was a decent programmer. I wasn't like the most talented in the world, but I was pretty good at it. But I remember the audio player was not working, and I had to listen to just bits and pieces over and over and over, and working on this stupid code. And then I was looking at the website, and I had everything laid out and everything perfectly in place, and there was this blank spot. And I remember looking at it and going, something's missing. What am I going to put here? And I know now it was just the Lord, but even though I didn't realize it at the time, I thought, I know, I'm going to summarize each lesson, and then I'll put a little summary paragraph or two there, and so that way they'll know what the lesson's about when they click on it. And I didn't know then that, in order to summarize the lessons, I had to read them. And of course, I didn't know the power of God's word because I had grown up with this dusty old book that was just a bunch of rules and stories. I wasn't concerned. But as I began to read her notes, my heart began to soften. Because all of a sudden I went from hearing about God's rules and his thumb on me and God's going to punish me and God hates me because I never measured up. All of a sudden I'm hearing about the heart and the character of God. All of a sudden I'm hearing about God's faithfulness and his trustworthiness. Specifically, a couple of things that I remember really jumped out at me. The first thing was how she was talking about how Joseph was a foreshadowing of Christ. And I had never connected the Old Testament to the New Testament. And, she had found 25 different ways that Joseph foreshadowed Christ. Now, scholars have found like 200. I think there's way more than that even. But this was fascinating to me, and I called and I began to ask her questions, and I said, Mom, you gotta tell me what you're learning about this. And it was just curiosity. I didn't see God coming after me. I'm just curious at this point. And she just very gently answered my question. She wasn't pushy. And I said, okay, that's cool. And I thought that was the end of it. And I was going back to my programming. But the next day, I couldn't get it out of my head. So I called and I asked her another question. Don't remember what that one was. So all of a sudden, I went from never calling her unless I felt like I had to calling her every single day after work. And I began to call her and talk all the way home. And in fact, I still do that. But I just began to ask her questions about the Bible. And she just began to teach me. And she wasn't pushing me. And I can see if she had been doing this in her own flesh years earlier, I think they would have been much different conversations. But she just answered my questions. And so about 6 months went by and I said, Mom, what's happened to me? 6 months ago, I was 180 degrees from where I am now. I didn't want anything to do with God. But now all I want is to hear the word of God. And she said, well, I've been praying that God would draw you back like a magnet. And I said, wow, that's exactly what God has done. And I think sometimes people hear that and they think, well, why hasn't God drawn my child? Why isn't my child that's still out there? Well, I had been in rebellion since I was 15. This had been probably 15 years at this point. About 7 living as transgender at that point. So she knew what it was like to wait many, many years for that prayer to be answered. But as we talked, I remember in particular, there was a big decision that had come up and some kind of major life decision, I think, finally, as I've shared this story a few times, I think it was when I was considering taking the job in Florida. And I remember, Mom had always told me what to do and given me advice and step 1, 2, 3, here's what's logical, here's what's reasonable. And I'll never forget, she said, well, why don't you pray about it? And I think you just need to trust the Lord. And I was like, what? Wait a minute. Wait, no. Where is your answer? You're supposed to tell me what the best thing to do is, And she just began to tell me, the Lord will lead you. This was totally out of my, wheelhouse. I didn't have any reference for that. What do you mean? I don't remember ever being taught to trust the Lord's guidance. We would pray about things and we would ask God to do what we wanted, or to do what seemed reasonable or what seemed good. But you mean I can ask the Lord for His will and I can trust Him? And I said, Mom, what's happened to you? You're not the mother I grew up with. And she told me how she had truly surrendered herself to the control of the Holy Spirit. And she had been totally changed. She was now filled with peace. Because growing up, I think in her own testimony, I hope she didn't mind sharing this, you've shared it in your testimony, that she would have considered herself kind of a legalistic Pharisee, working so hard. She said before she was on this performance treadmill for God, trying so hard to please God by all this external work. But in the meantime, her heart was still critical and judgmental and dealing with all these things. But when she began to give control to the Holy Spirit and let Him work through her, she was changed. And when the Lord opened my eyes to how much my mom had changed, it was at that moment that I knew the gospel was true. Not just intellectually, not just historically, but it was real and alive. And I went home that night, and I threw myself on the floor, and I began to just confess everything I could think of, and I asked the Lord to bring back everything that I had done in my life, and I just wanted to be like scrubbed clean. And I remember one thing the Lord brought up was a time when I was in high school that I was praying to Satan, asking Satan to keep people from coming to know Jesus, because I was so angry at God and angry at Christians. And I thought, why would God want me? You know, am I too far gone? By this point, I've been living as a man for 7 years. I've walked away from my family. I had alienated everybody in my life. I've taken all these hormones. I've had so much sin in my life. I thought maybe I'm too far gone. And so for a couple of days, I just felt completely empty. I was so restless. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I don't even know how I got through work. But as I began to think about it, and part of me wanted to pray, but I just felt so unworthy. And I was riding down a glass elevator at work, sort of looking out over the city, and I was watching this couple across the street. And I said, God, I want to serve you again. I remembered my calling to be a missionary. The Lord had never let me forget that, even though I felt like Jonah. Like I knew I was running from the Lord. And I knew I had a calling in my life. And I said, God, I want to serve you again, but I don't know where to start. God said, start with them. And I was like, what? Wait a minute. No. Now, first of all, I've never heard God talk to me. And second of all, this is crazy. Like, you know, I don't know. Like, first of all, what do you mean? Second of all, this isn't God. This is just, I'm just hearing things. But my heart began to pound so hard. And I thought, you know, what am I going to do? And my heart's racing, and I thought, okay, this is so stupid. And I went outside, and I thought, no, by the time I get out there, they're going to be like way down the street anyway. So I'm not even going to have time, because they were out in front of the building. I was going out the back. I thought, there's no way I'll catch them. But when I got outside, I looked, and they were sitting at the bus stop right in front of my building. I thought, great. It's like God has packaged them right there, just waiting for me. And I thought, you know, but by the time I get over there, the bus will come, and then we'll start talking, but then it's going to be really awkward, so I'm just not going to worry about it. I'm going to go back inside. I went back in the building 4 times, and the Lord would not let it go. And I felt like an elephant was on my chest. And I remember at one point, in one sense, there's all this pressure, like I can't breathe, but at the same time, I can feel my heart pounding out to here. I'm like, that's not even physically possible. How do I feel my heart, 6 inches from my chest? But that's how I felt. And I thought, this is dumb, but I know that I cannot get any peace until I go talk to them. So if I make a complete fool of myself, at least I will have done it. And I can say, okay, God, fine. I did what you asked. And so I went over there, feet heavy as lead. And I'm walking over there, and I said, and it was funny, like, you know how a lot of times if you walk up to people in public, a lot of times they don't really notice you, or they might say hi or something, but they just both turned and stared at me and waited. Like they were just waiting for me to say something. And I went, hi. I never do this, but I feel like God, and I'm just racking my brain because God hadn't said anything else. And I'm like, he's kind of giving me just one word at a time as I feel like God wants me to pray with you. Is there anything I can pray with you about? And then I felt stupid because I thought, I was thinking that the Lord would give me like some big prophecy and he was going to tell me everything going on in their life. But as I said that, tears started streaming down their faces. They were so shocked that God had sent somebody to pray for them. They said, we just moved to town. Like literally, they had just gotten there yesterday. They said, we've just moved to town. We don't know anybody. We don't have a job. We don't know where we're going to live. And I'm like, wow. And in retrospect, I wish I'd have helped them more. But I was so stunned by all this, and I said, okay, let me pray for you. And in that moment, I realized that God wasn't done with me. And I put my faith in Jesus Christ, and I said, I already knew it all. I mean, I had heard the gospel all my life. I was raised in church, Christian school. But it was like, at that moment, I said, Lord, I am completely yours. And I just surrendered my life to the Lord. And it was like, it was like lighting a match on a fire that's already been built, you know. All it needed was that spark, that match. And as I began to pray for them, I began to feel the power of God come on me, the Spirit of God come on me with such power. I couldn't even stand up straight. I was swaying back and forth, and I thought, you know, if we weren't standing, or if they weren't sitting down, I'd have pulled us all to the ground. And I felt like I was being washed from the inside out. And after I said amen, I could feel like light was just bursting forth from my chest. And I was radically transformed in that moment. And I remember all of a sudden, all these scriptures and hymns began flooding back to my mind. I remember in particular the song that was on the next page that we were singing today, There's Power in the Blood. I was like, I get it. For the first time, like, that song never made sense when I was a kid. All of a sudden, I get it. And I went back to in fact, I called my mom to tell her what happened, and she told me months later that just from the phone call, she knew I was changed because I sounded different. And I was completely changed. And I thought this was great because God had saved me. And I was going to be a man of God. And I didn't realize that God was going to want to change me. You know, but I was so sincere and I was so zealous, and all my desires and everything began to change. And I was beginning to share my faith with my friends, and He was convicting me of sin. And I knew, I have absolutely no doubt, I was so transformed. I knew I was completely different. In fact, I remember reading that verse later in 2 Corinthians where it says, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things have become new. And I remembered hearing that verse in high school and thinking, I'm not a new creation. I knew that. I didn't know how to explain it other than I just knew. And I think it was just the Spirit of God convicting me that I knew I was not new. I was not born again, but this time I was. And so over the next few months, the Lord began to convict me. But it was like, okay, God, I recognize this wasn't your will, but, you know, I can't do anything about it now. I'm legally male. I've had these surgeries. I've had these hormones. I have facial hair, and there's nothing I can do about it now. So I know this wasn't your plan, but let's work with what we've got. But the Lord began convicting me more and more. And by this time, I was listening to the radio all day long at work. The Lord had given me a new job. In fact, it's funny. I look back, and I think one of the ways where the Lord really began to turn my life, just before Mom asked me to make the website, God had given me this job where my boss was a Christian. And in particular, I knew that God had given me this job because I shouldn't have gotten it for several reasons. One, I completely blew the interview because I was working for a temp agency at the time. It was a temp to hire, and they had really misinformed me about the job. So I was talking about a completely different job. But for several reasons, I knew God had given me this job, and I absolutely loved it. And for the first time, I was thankful to God. And in Romans 1, where it begins to talk about how people are given over to their lusts and these unnatural desires and eventually to a reprobate mind, one of the very first things it says is that they were not thankful to God. So I think this began to reverse the process as I was finally thankful to God. So, but here I am going through this job, and I'm being more and more convicted all the time. But I didn't know what to do about it. And eventually, I heard this guy on the radio one time. I had been such a fan of this radio program. And his name was Dr. Everett Piper. I don't know if anybody's familiar with him. But he's become a dear friend. And I was hearing him on the radio all the time talking about all these different Christian topics. But one day he starts talking about transgenderism. And I kind of tuned out and I thought, that's okay. He doesn't understand my story. He doesn't know that I've been saved. One day, you know, maybe he'll see things from my perspective, but I just didn't worry about it. But the next week, he was talking about the same thing. And again, the next week, and the next week, and the next week, and the next week. I didn't realize that this was in 2015, and I didn't realize that after the Obergefell decision, which was the Supreme Court decision where they legalized gay marriage, transgenderism just exploded. And it was like a spirit was let loose on this country. And that's why we have seen such a rise in transgenderism. Now this is actually from ancient times. It's nothing new. Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun. But this was all of a sudden one of the biggest issues in culture. And as I began to listen to him, I thought, I've either got to turn off this is my favorite program of the week, I've either got to turn him off or I've got to start listening. I can't keep pretending I'm not hearing what he's saying. So I thought, okay, I'm going to give him one more chance. And I was shocked because what he said wasn't hateful. What he said was, we are not just made up of our feelings, our instincts, and our desires. We are made in the image of God. And we can choose our behavior despite how we feel. And that was kind of revolutionary to me, and I thought, okay, God, I realize this is a choice, but what do I do about it now? I don't know how to fix this. But the Lord really began to open my eyes. And he began to show me the evil of this agenda. And in fact, I eventually, the Lord had opened my eyes to it so much, I began to see when they, remember all the bathroom bills and things where they were, like Target was allowing a man to go in a woman's bathroom just because he said he was a woman, didn't even have to be dressed as a woman. And I knew that was crazy, and I actually signed the Boycott Target pledge from the American Family Association before I left the lifestyle. Because even I recognized that was crazy. But I still didn't know what to do about it. And I remember my dad was teaching me about prophecy. He'd been going to all these prophecy conferences, and I thought, great, this is my answer. I thought maybe Jesus will come back, and I just won't have to deal with this. It'd be like, whoops, I ran out of time. Really would have, but I didn't have time to change back. And I knew that wasn't true. I was just hoping and holding on for dear life, like it would be any day now. And but I called Mom around that time, and I said, Mom, what are you studying in Bible study? And she said, well, I've been studying on the judgment seat of Christ. I said, oh, wait a minute. I thought, I'm forgiven. My sins are covered now, right? And I didn't realize that we are still going to stand before the Lord and give an account of our life. And I went home that night terrified, and again threw myself on the floor, and I said, Lord, you can have my life, whatever you want. I really surrender everything this time. And I started naming everything I could think of in my life. I said, I surrender it all. My finances, my job, my everything. You can have it all. What do you want from me? What do I need to do to hear, well done, good and faithful servant? And the Lord said, if you stood before me tonight, what name would I call? I was like, wait a minute, no. I've legally changed my name now. My name is Jacob. I was going by Jake, but I said, this is who I am now. But I knew he was not going to call me Jake. He reminded me of John chapter 1 where it says, Jesus Christ himself is the creator. And he said, you cannot claim to love me and yet reject my creation. And there was a moment where I thought I was being condemned. But in the most loving voice I've ever heard in all my life, he whispered to me and he said, let me tell you who you are. And that is what began to really free me. Because all of a sudden, I realized that I was created with an identity, and with a purpose, and with a plan. And no matter what I'd done to myself, God still knew who I was. I was not hidden from him. And so I said, okay, Lord, I'm yours, but I don't know how to fix this. And I began to cry to the Lord night after night after night. And finally, about the last 2 months, I begged the Lord with all my heart to take my life because I saw no way out. I didn't know how to fix this broken mess. And so I had pictured myself in this deep, dark pit that I couldn't get out of. And I had a clear vision, or I was looking up at the top, and I could kind of see the light. I didn't have a way out. It was too high. And the Lord reminded me of Matthew chapter 16, verse 24 through 26, which changed my life. And it says, if anyone will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake shall find it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his own soul? Or what shall he give in exchange for his soul? And I remember thinking, what if I hang on to this because I don't see any other way out? Because I can't even conceive of being a girl. Every time I thought of being a girl, it was so painful. What if I hang on to it and I lose everything? And I said, and I had a clear vision of Jesus Christ, because I said, what do I do? course. And I had a clear vision of Jesus Christ getting down on one knee. He reached his hand down into the pit, and he said, "Do you trust me?" And I thought about it for a moment, and I knew he was asking me to just walk away from everything. And I had no plan. And I said, "Okay, Lord." And I literally just left it all. I walked away from my partner, my job, everything I knew, the identity, sold everything I had, pretty much. And I really went through a time of depression when I realized all the things I had accumulated in this world really weren't worth much. I ended up giving most of it away. Came home with almost nothing. It felt completely dead. And I thought, "Okay, Lord, I'm here. What now?" And I felt so empty for a time, and there was so much grief. I didn't realize that I was dying to self, dying to this identity. And I grieved for several days, and I cried so hard. I would take I had just a few clothes left before I bought any female clothes, just sweats and t-shirts. And I would take one thing out of my suitcase at a time and just cry for an hour because the grief was unbearable. But then a few days later, my mom, she didn't know how close I was to going back and giving up. And I was ready to just throw in the towel. And actually, I'll back up and just tell one quick thing. Sunday, the first day I came home, I was scared out of my mind. I cried all the way through church, all the way through Sunday school, and I thought I had made a huge mistake. And I went back to my apartment that afternoon to grab a few things, and I said, "I'll be home tomorrow." But in my mind, I was like, "I'm not so sure I'm coming back." But when I showed back up at my apartment, my partner gave me a hug, and I felt like I was in the arms of a stranger. Like I knew him, but it was unfamiliar. I'd called him my wife. Remember, this was a man living as a woman. I'd called him my wife for 8 years. And we sat in the apartment, this place that had been my home for 8 years, and watching a movie, and I felt like I was in a hotel room. And I said, "God, this is so weird. What's going on?" God said, "I have cut the cord on your old life, and you are not going back." And I said, "Okay." And so I went home, and so a few days later, I was grieving so much that I thought, I'm just going to go back and face the eternal consequences because I can't handle this. This is too painful. And I cried for days till I had no more tears. And finally, Mom put this pile of cards in front of me that the women in her Bible study had written to me. And they weren't just signed, like most of them had poured out their hearts to me. And on top of that, they'd raised over $1,600 to buy me a new wardrobe. And I said, "Mom, these women don't even know me." And she said, "But they have been praying for you and they love you." And I showed up the next morning at her Bible study, and these women surrounded me and embraced me with more love than I have ever felt from women. And I felt for the first time finally accepted as a woman. I didn't even look. This is 36, 48 hours out of the lifestyle. And they completely embraced me as a woman. I didn't look much like a woman then, but they loved me. And we have in the church today, we have two very different positions on what love looks like. And there are many that believe love is affirming whatever sin people want to do and celebrating it and telling them how wonderful it is. And then there's the kind of love that embraces the truth and embraces who we truly are. And these women loved me as one of the women and as one of them and embraced me. And I am forever thankful. And after that, it was like the transgenderism lie just broke. And I knew that I was not meant to be a woman. And I stand here today not as just putting on an act, just putting on a dress to show up and tell my story. The Lord has truly transformed me over the last 4 years as I've truly given my life wholeheartedly to Christ. Not perfectly, obviously. There are still times I struggle, but the Lord has radically transformed my life and my heart and has given me new life and has given me this journey of faith, just walking and trusting Him every day. And He's so transformed me now that a lot of people don't even believe I was ever transgender. You know, I've become so feminine. I'm feminine more than a lot of my friends that are girls. So this, again, is a story of how the Lord can transform no matter what someone is going through, no matter what they're feeling, no matter how far they've run, no matter what darkness they're in. The Lord can rescue us. The Lord can save us. And He alone is the one that can heal the broken heart. So I just want to encourage you today, whether it's maybe something you're struggling with, you know, give these things to the Lord. You don't want to find yourself in 20 years way down the road, having gone your own way. Or if you have a prodigal, don't give up praying. Because no matter where they are, the Lord knows exactly who they are and where they are. Thank you.